March 9, 1933. Washington, D.C., 11:47 p.m. Alone in a dim Treasury office, Marriner Eccles signs a document that will quietly reshape the financial foundation of the United States. No announcement, no hearing, no vote. Outside, the city trembles in the grip of the worst banking crisis in American history. Inside, one man rewrites how every dollar in America will be created, controlled, and distributed. At that moment, private banks still believe they run the nation's credit. Wall Street believes it owns the money supply, and Congress believes it controls the purse. They are all wrong. Because in the next 36 hours, during a crisis only he fully understands, this banker will execute a silent coup, a peaceful procedural takeover that shifts the center of financial power from private hands to Washington. A coup that will change the Federal Reserve's identity, centralize national monetary authority, and define the value of every dollar for the next century, and almost no one will ever know it happened. Chapter 1. America's Chaotic Money System. Before 1933, American banking was a spectacular mess, a fractured empire of competing currencies, unstable credit, and recurring disasters that wiped out entire communities overnight. 9,000 independent banks operated across the United States. Each issued its own currency notes. Each set its own lending standards. Each hoarded its own reserves. When one failed, panic rippled through neighboring institutions like a contagion. Between 1873 and 1933, the United States experienced 16 major banking panics, roughly one every 4 years. In rural Iowa, a farmer might hold deposits in 3 different banks, each with different withdrawal rules and different backing. In New York, Wall Street financiers traded in currencies from Massachusetts, Illinois, and Pennsylvania, each worth slightly different amounts depending on the issuing bank's reputation. The money supply wasn't a national concept. It was a patchwork quilt of private promises. The Federal Reserve, created in 1913, was supposed to fix this. It didn't. The Fed was structured as a loose confederation of 12 regional banks, each semi-autonomous, each controlled by local bankers. The New York Fed, dominated by J.P. Morgan's successors, functioned as a private institution that happened to have a government charter. Benjamin Strong, who ran the New York Fed until 1928, operated like a monarch. He set interest rates. He decided liquidity. He coordinated with the Bank of England more closely than with Washington. Wall Street assumed, correctly, that it, not the federal government, controlled America's money. Congress couldn't even audit the Fed's books without permission. And then came 1929. The stock market collapsed in October. By 1931, banks were failing at a rate of 70 per month. By 1932, industrial production had dropped 46%. Unemployment hit 25%. In Chicago, depositors lined up for blocks to withdraw their savings before their banks closed. In Detroit, the entire banking system collapsed in a single morning. Families lost everything. Homes, farms, businesses, because the private banking system had no mechanism to stop the hemorrhaging. Wall Street believed the crisis was manageable. Markets correct themselves, the bankers said. Government intervention will only make it worse. One man knew they were catastrophically wrong. Chapter 2. The Man Who Saw the System. Cracking Marriner Eccles was not supposed to be a revolutionary. Born into a wealthy Mormon banking family in Utah, Eccles inherited a small empire of lumber mills, construction companies, and community banks. He was conservative, methodical, and deeply skeptical of government overreach. By all conventional measures, he should have sided with Wall Street. But Eccles had something the New York bankers lacked: direct exposure to the collapsing economy. His bank served farmers, small business owners, and working families. He watched them drown. He saw how the private banking system, his own system, was structurally incapable of stopping the spiral. In early 1933, Eccles wrote a private memo that would later be discovered in Treasury archives. It read, "The belief that private banks can regulate credit in the national interest is a dangerous fiction. Banks are motivated by profit, not stability. In a crisis, they contract credit precisely when expansion is needed. They hoard reserves when liquidity is required. The result is a death spiral. Only a central authority, insulated from private interest and empowered to act against market incentives, can break this cycle." He presented his ideas to congressional committees. They ignored him. He wrote to influential bankers. They dismissed him as a regional eccentric. He published essays in obscure journals, arguing for radical centralization of monetary policy. No one listened, until Franklin Roosevelt called him to Washington in February 1933. Chapter 3. The crisis arrives, March 4th, 1933. 6:32 a.m., Eccles' phone rings in his Washington hotel room. It's the White House. "The President wants you in the cabinet room, now." When Eccles arrives, the room is chaos. Treasury Secretary William Wooden is pacing. Advisors are shouting over each other. A ticker tape machine in the corner spits out numbers that confirm what everyone already knows. The American banking system is dying in real time. 38 states have declared bank holidays, legal suspensions that prevent withdrawals. In the states still open, depositors are forming mobs. In New York, the stock exchange has closed indefinitely. Gold is flowing out of the country at $20 million per day. The money supply is contracting so rapidly that economists can't calculate the velocity. Roosevelt, inaugurated just hours earlier, sits at the head of the table. His face is calm, but his knuckles are white. "Gentlemen," he says quietly, "we have 48 hours before the entire financial system of the United States collapses. If we don't stabilize the banks by Monday morning, there will be revolution in the streets." He turns to Eccles. "I'm told you have ideas, radical ideas." Eccles opens his briefcase. Inside is a 74-page proposal he's been refining for 2 years. It outlines a complete restructuring of the Federal Reserve System, a transfer of power from regional banks to a centralized board of governors in Washington, controlled by presidential appointees, with authority to override private bank decisions in the national interest. Wall Street would call it nationalization. Eccles calls it survival. "Mr. President," he says, "fix it, or everything burns." Roosevelt leans forward. "Then burn the old system." Chapter 4. The Banker's War Room. For the next 72 hours, Eccles operates from a converted storage room in the Treasury basement. Maps cover the walls, red pins marking failed banks, blue pins marking solvent institutions, black pins marking riots. He assembles a team of 12 economists, lawyers, and statisticians. None of them sleep. They work in shifts, drafting emergency orders, calculating reserve requirements, wargaming responses from regional Fed banks. At 2 a.m. on March 6th, Eccles presents his plan to the full cabinet. "We don't have the legal authority to do this," Attorney General Homer Cummings objects. "The Federal Reserve Act doesn't grant the president power to restructure the system." Eccles doesn't blink. "We will when I'm finished." His proposal has 3 components. First, declare a national bank holiday, close every bank in America for 4 days while examiners determine which are solvent. Second, use an obscure provision of the Trading with the Enemy Act, passed during World War I, to give the president emergency control over banking operations and gold transactions. Third, reopen only banks that meet new federal standards, effectively forcing every institution to submit to Washington's authority or die. It's a constitutional gamble. The Supreme Court could overturn it, Congress could refuse to ratify it, Wall Street could fight it in every court in the country, but Eccles has calculated something they haven't. In a true crisis, legality is negotiable. By the time anyone challenges this, he tells Roosevelt, the old system will already be dead. Chapter 5. the secret negotiations. While the legal framework is being drafted, Eccles makes phone calls. He calls the presidents of the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks. He explains, calmly, methodically, that their independence is about to end. The New York Fed will no longer set national monetary policy. The Board of Governors in Washington will. Some resist. The president of the Boston Fed hangs up on him. The president of the Chicago Fed threatens to sue. Eccles responds with cold precision. If you don't cooperate, the president will use emergency powers to replace you. Your choice, irrelevant advisory role or unemployment. He calls the U.S. heads of America's largest private banks, J.P. Morgan Jr., Winthrop Aldrich of Chase, Albert Wiggin of National City. He offers them a deal. Submit to federal oversight, accept new reserve requirements, and you'll survive. Fight us, and we'll let you collapse. Each thinks they're negotiating. They're not. Eccles is consolidating control, using their fear as leverage. Every concession they make, every agreement to temporary emergency measures, becomes a permanent expansion of federal authority. By March 8th, he has verbal commitments from 8 of the 12 regional Fed banks and conditional support from Wall Street's most powerful players. Chapter 6. The Emergency Maneuver. March 9th, 1933. 11 years p.m. Roosevelt signs the Emergency Banking Act. The law is 9 pages long. Congress debates it for 7 hours and passes it with only 3 dissenting votes. Most congressmen don't fully understand what they're voting for. They see a crisis management bill. Eccles sees a constitutional revolution. Buried in Section 4 is a clause granting the Federal Reserve Board emergency authority to regulate credit conditions in the national interest, superseding decisions of regional banks. Buried in Section 6 is language allowing the Treasury Secretary to require delivery of all gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates held by private citizens and institutions. The emergency liquidity provisions authorize the Fed to issue currency backed by any assets the government deems acceptable, not just gold, not just commercial paper, but anything. Government bonds, mortgages, corporate debt. For the first time in American history, the money supply is no longer constrained by physical reserves. It's a function of federal policy. Eccles has done something financial orthodoxy said was impossible. He's severed the link between money and private capital. Chapter 7. The moment private money dies March 13, 1933. 10 a.m., banks begin reopening under federal supervision. Within the first hour, $300 million flows back into the system, deposits returning from mattresses and safety deposit boxes. By the end of the week, $1 billion has been redeposited. The panic is over. But the power structure has fundamentally changed. Consider the numbers. Before March 9th, private banks controlled 94% of currency issuance through their reserve decisions. After March 9th, the Federal Reserve Board in Washington controls 100% of currency issuance through its emergency powers. Before March 9th, the New York Fed set discount rates independently. After March 9th, all discount rates are set by the Board of Governors, appointed by the President. Before March 9th, banks could refuse federal oversight. After March 9th, any bank operating without federal approval is classified as insolvent and closed. In private offices across Wall Street, bankers stare at teletype machines, watching the numbers come in, realizing what has happened. Thomas Lamont, a J.P. Morgan partner, writes in his diary, "We have lost. Not just this battle, the war. The federal government now controls credit. They control lending. They control the very definition of money. We are no longer sovereign. It's the psychological collapse of an entire class. Like German generals in 1944, realizing that American logistics would bury them, Wall Street's titans comprehend, too late, that the architecture of power has shifted beneath their feet." Chapter 8. Washington realizes what he's done. March 20th, 1933. Roosevelt calls Eccles into the Oval Office. "I've been reading the fine print of the Banking Act," the president says. "Specifically, the part where you gave the Federal Reserve Board authority to override regional banks in perpetuity." Eccles nods. "That wasn't a temporary emergency provision, was it?" "No, Mr. President." Roosevelt studies him for a long moment. "You rewrote the Federal Reserve System without telling anyone what you were doing." "Correct. Congress thinks they passed a crisis management bill. They don't realize they permanently transferred monetary control from Wall Street to Washington." "Also correct." Roosevelt leans back, a slight smile forming. "You magnificent bastard." Treasury Secretary Wooden is less amused. In a cabinet meeting the next day, he erupts. "Do you understand the constitutional implications of what you've done? You've centralized more financial power than any official in American history. More than Alexander Hamilton, more than Nicholas Biddle. You've made the Federal Reserve an arm of the executive branch." Eccles's response is clinical. "I've made it functional." But the cabinet understands the truth. They're dependent on him now. The economy is stabilizing because of his system. If they reverse course, the panic returns. If they challenge him, they risk collapse. Because it's working. Chapter 9. Wall Street's Quiet Rage. In April 1933, Eccles receives 47 letters from private bankers. They range from polite objections to barely veiled threats. Winthrop Aldrich writes, "Your policies represent an existential threat to free market banking. We will contest them in every legal forum available." Albert Wiggin writes, "You have nationalized credit under the guise of emergency management. History will judge this as tyranny." The American Bankers Association publishes a white paper titled "The Dangerous Concentration of Monetary Power," arguing that Eccles's reforms will lead to inflation, corruption, and the death of private enterprise. Eccles reads every letter. His responses are brief and identical. "The world changed on March 9th. Your objections are noted and irrelevant." In May, Wall Street's most powerful bankers arrange a private meeting with him. They gather in a conference room at the New York Fed, territory they still believe is theirs. Eccles arrives alone. Thomas Lamont opens. "We want to discuss reversing certain provisions of the Emergency Banking Act, specifically the centralization of discount rate authority and the removal of regional bank autonomy." Eccles sets his briefcase on the table. "No. We represent $18 billion in capital." "You represent nothing," Eccles interrupts. "Your capital exists because the federal government guarantees it. Your deposits exist because the FDIC insures them. Your liquidity exists because the Federal Reserve provides it. You have no leverage. You have no sovereignty. You are intermediaries in a system I now control." The room is silent. Finally, J.P. Morgan Jr. speaks, his voice hollow. "What do you want from us?" "Compliance," Eccles says. "Nothing more." He leaves. The meeting lasts 11 minutes. One banker later writes in his diary, "We thought we were negotiating. We were being informed of our capitulation." Chapter 10. The Federal Reserve Transformed. The technical transformation of the Federal Reserve between 1933 and 1935 is as profound as any political revolution. Before Eccles, 12 semi-autonomous regional banks, New York Fed, dominant in policy, private bankers serving as directors with veto power. No federal oversight of reserve requirements, discount rates set regionally. No coordination with fiscal policy, gold standard constraining money supply. After Eccles, centralized board of governors with supreme authority. 7-member board appointed by president, confirmed by Senate regional banks, reduced to administrative branches. Federal Reserve Board sets all discount rates nationally, unified reserve requirements across all banks, coordination with Treasury on fiscal policy, elastic money supply, responsive to economic conditions. The Banking Act of 1935, drafted almost entirely by Eccles, codifies these changes permanently. Consider the mechanics. The Federal Reserve Board gains authority to set reserve requirements for all member banks, up to 100% of deposits, control all open market operations, regulate consumer credit, supervise bank holding companies, determine qualifications for Fed officials. Every major monetary decision now flows through 7 presidentially appointed governors serving 14-year terms. It's the industrial-scale nationalization of credit control, wrapped in bureaucratic language that obscures its revolutionary nature. Economists will debate for decades whether this represents progress or tyranny. But the transformation is irreversible. Washington now controls every credit dollar in America. Chapter 11. The Bankers' Critics Collapse. In 1934, Senator Carter Glass, co-author of the original Federal Reserve Act, attacks Eccles publicly. "You have destroyed the independence of the Federal Reserve," Glass declares on the Senate floor. "You have made it a tool of political manipulation. Inflation will devour this nation's savings. Interest rates will be weaponized. The dollar will become worthless." Eccles doesn't respond. He doesn't need to, because the numbers speak. 1933. GDP growth returns for the first time since 1929. 1934. Bank failures drop from 4,000 tons per year to 62, 1935. Industrial production rises 45%, 1936. Unemployment falls from 25% to 17%. The banking system stabilizes. Credit flows. The death spiral reverses. Eccles' critics predicted disaster. Instead, markets recover, deposits return, and panic ends. It's the economic equivalent of watching American supply columns roll across Europe, unstoppable, overwhelming, proving that the critics' theories were beautiful, but wrong. By 1936, even Senator Glass quietly stops his attacks. Chapter 12. Public has no idea. Here's the remarkable part. Almost no one notices. The New York Times covers the Banking Act of 1935 on page 14, treating it as a minor administrative adjustment. The Washington Post publishes a 200-word summary. Radio broadcasts mention it briefly between advertisements. Ordinary Americans are unaware their monetary system has been fundamentally rewired. They notice banks are stable again. They notice jobs are returning. They notice Roosevelt's confidence. But the constitutional revolution happening in Washington's bureaucratic corridors? Invisible. Eccles prefers it this way. "The less the public understands monetary policy," he tells an aide, "the more freely we can act in their interest." It's a chilling statement. Benevolent technocracy at its purest. The belief that experts, insulated from democratic pressure, can manage the economy better than elected officials or market forces. And for the remainder of the 1930s, the system holds. Chapter 13. The Constitutional Question. Inside the Justice Department, lawyers quietly debate whether Eccles' reforms are legal. A confidential memo dated July 1935 lays out the problem. The Banking Act grants the Federal Reserve Board authority that arguably exceeds constitutional limits on executive power. The board can now control the money supply, set interest rates, determine credit conditions, and regulate banking operations, all without congressional oversight or judicial review. This represents a delegation of legislative power that may violate separation of powers. The memo concludes with a question: did Eccles save the nation or subvert the Constitution? It's never answered, because resolving the question would require dismantling a system that's working. And no president, no Congress, no court wants to trigger another crisis by challenging it. So the legal ambiguity persists, a constitutional compromise born of necessity, maintained by fear. Chapter 14. His enemies realize the new reality. December 1936, New York City. Wall Street's most powerful bankers gather for an annual dinner at the Metropolitan Club. It's a private affair. No press, no outsiders. After dinner, Thomas Lamont stands. "Gentlemen," he says, "I propose we discuss our strategy for reversing the centralization of the Federal Reserve." Silence. Finally, Winthrop Aldrich speaks. "Tom, there is no strategy. We have capital, we have influence, we have nothing," Aldrich interrupts. "Eccles controls more, financial power than any banker in human history. He decides when banks fail. He decides when they survive. He sets the cost of every dollar we lend. We exist at his pleasure." Someone mutters, "The government owns credit now." Another, "Wall Street will never be sovereign again." The psychological defeat is total. These men, who once dictated terms to presidents, now understand they are subordinate to a bureaucrat in Washington. One banker writes in his diary that night, "We built a system where private capital ruled. In 1 week in 1933, Eccles demolished it, and we handed him the tools." Chapter 15. The Man Behind the Curtain. April 1937. Washington, D.C. Marriner Eccles sits in his Federal Reserve office on Constitution Avenue, reviewing economic reports. Outside his window, construction crews are building new government buildings, physical monuments to Roosevelt's expanding bureaucracy. Inside, Eccles has built something more permanent, an invisible architecture of control that will outlive every building in the city. He's 46 years old. In 4 years, he's accomplished what took the Bank of England 2 centuries. He's centralized monetary authority in a democratic republic, a feat many economists believed was impossible. But he's also made enemies who will never forgive him. In his desk drawer, he keeps a folder of death threats. 17 letters, some anonymous, some signed. One reads, "You have stolen America's financial soul. God will judge you for this tyranny." Eccles reads them occasionally, not out of fear, but curiosity. He wonders if his critics understand what they're really angry about. It's not the centralization itself. It's the permanence. What he built in March 1933 can't be undone without triggering the very crisis it was designed to prevent. The system is self-perpetuating, self-justifying, immune to political change. That was always the plan. Chapter 16. The Battle for History. By 1938, the political battle over Eccles's legacy is in full swing. Conservative economists publish books attacking his reforms. Herbert Hoover, the former president, writes scathing op-eds arguing that Eccles has created a monetary dictatorship that will inevitably lead to inflation and corruption. Progressive economists defend him just as fiercely. John Maynard Keynes, the British economist, calls Eccles's restructuring the most important institutional innovation in modern capitalism. But these debates happen in academic journals and policy circles, places ordinary Americans never see. The public remains oblivious. In small towns across America, farmers discuss crop prices and weather. In cities, factory workers worry about wages and strikes. The mechanics of who controls the money supply? It's invisible, abstract, incomprehensible. Eccles understands this. He's built a system that operates beyond public consciousness, in the bureaucratic shadows, where technical decisions are made by experts who answer to no one. In a private conversation recorded by an aide, Eccles reflects on this. Democracy functions best when the people elect leaders who appoint experts who make decisions the people don't understand. It's not tyranny, it's efficiency. The aide asks, "But isn't that dangerous? What if the experts are wrong?" Eccles pauses, considering. "Then we'll fix it, quietly, before anyone notices." Chapter 17. Wall Street learns to cooperate. June 1939. The relationship between Eccles and Wall Street has evolved from open warfare to cold cooperation. The major banks have adapted to the new reality. They've hired lobbyists who understand how to navigate the Federal Reserve's bureaucracy. They've placed their executives on advisory committees that technically have no power but provide access to decision-makers. They've learned to work within Eccles's system rather than against it. In a meeting at the New York Fed, Winthrop Aldrich presents a proposal for expanding commercial lending under the new reserve requirements. It's technical, carefully worded to appear as a request rather than a demand. Eccles listens, asks 3 questions, then approves the proposal with minor modifications. After the meeting, Aldrich's assistant asks, "Why didn't you push back more? We could have negotiated better terms." Aldrich shakes his head. "This isn't a negotiation. It never was. Eccles controls the framework. We're just trying to maximize our position within it." It's a stunning admission from a man who once ran one of America's most powerful banks. The titans of Wall Street have become supplicants in a system they no longer control. Chapter 18. The Price of Stability. By 1940, the American economy has transformed. Unemployment has fallen to 15%. Industrial production has surpassed 1929 levels. Bank failures are virtually non-existent. The financial panic that nearly destroyed the nation in 1933 seems like ancient history. But there are tensions beneath the surface. Some economists notice that the federal government's debt has nearly doubled since 1933. Others observe that the Federal Reserve's balance sheet has expanded in ways that have no historical precedent. Critics warn that Eccles has created a system where Washington can spend without limit, where monetary policy can be used to finance political priorities, where the line between fiscal and monetary policy has disappeared. Eccles dismisses these concerns publicly. Privately, he's more cautious. In a confidential memo to Roosevelt dated September 1940, he writes, "We have built a machine capable of extraordinary intervention. That power can stabilize an economy or destroy it. The difference is wisdom in its use. Future leaders must understand that what we can do is not always what we should do." Roosevelt never responds to the memo. 3 months later, he wins re-election to a 3rd term. The economy is recovering. The public is grateful. The mechanics of how it all works remain invisible. Chapter 19. The Coup No One Saw, December 1941. The Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. America enters World War II. Within weeks, the Federal Reserve's war powers activate. Eccles coordinates with the Treasury to finance military production on a scale that would have been impossible under the old system. The government issues bonds. The Fed buys them. Money flows into factories, shipyards, and training camps. The economy mobilizes in months rather than years. This is the ultimate vindication of Eccles's system. When crisis demands rapid, massive intervention, Washington can act without asking Wall Street for permission. But it also reveals the power he's created. During the war, the Federal Reserve will purchase $24 billion in government securities, more than the entire federal budget in 1933. It will set interest rates at artificial lows to reduce borrowing costs. It will coordinate directly with military planners to ensure liquidity flows to strategic industries. Eccles has built a system where monetary policy becomes a weapon of war, and no one questions it, because it's working. In a speech at the Treasury in 1942, Eccles reflects on the journey. 7 years ago, we faced financial collapse. Private banks were failing. The money supply was contracting. Credit was frozen. We had 2 choices: preserve the old system and watch the nation die, or build something new and risk the unknown. We chose the unknown, and here we are. The audience applauds politely. They don't fully understand what he's describing. They don't realize they're witnessing the culmination of the silent coup. Chapter 20. The Final Architecture, January 1948. Marriner Eccles steps down as chairman of the Federal Reserve after 14 years. His farewell is quiet, a small ceremony attended by Treasury officials and Federal Reserve governors. No public celebration, no major press coverage. He's 57 years old. He'll live another 30 years, watching the system he built evolve in ways he never anticipated. But on his last day in office, he takes a moment to walk through the Federal Reserve building alone. He passes the offices where thousands of economists now work, analyzing data that didn't exist in 1933. He passes conference rooms where committees meet to discuss reserve requirements, discount rates, and open market operations, technical decisions that affect millions of Americans who will never know these rooms exist. He passes the vault where gold reserves are stored, reserves that no longer determine the money supply because he severed that link 15 years ago. And he thinks about what he's built. A system where 7 appointed officials, serving 14-year terms, control the credit conditions for the entire American economy. A system where monetary policy operates beyond democratic oversight, justified by expertise and necessity. A system where power is concentrated, permanent, and invisible. In his final memo to the Board of Governors, Eccles writes, "What we've created is not perfect. It concentrates authority in ways that should make any Democrat uncomfortable. But it's functional, and in moments of crisis, functionality matters more than ideology. The question is not whether this system is ideal. The question is whether any alternative could have prevented the catastrophe we faced in 1933. I don't believe one could have." He seals the memo and places it in the Federal Reserve Archives, where it will remain classified for 30 years. Return to that dim Treasury office. March 9th, 1933, 11:47 p.m. Marriner Eccles signs the last emergency order, places it in an envelope, and seals it. Outside, America sleeps through the most significant transfer of financial power in its history. Inside, one man has rewritten the monetary genome of the nation. The banks will reopen Monday. The depositors will return. The crisis will pass. And the silent coup will remain silent. Not because it's been hidden, but because almost no one understands what happened. Congress believes they passed emergency legislation to save the banks. Wall Street believes they negotiated a temporary compromise. The public believes Roosevelt saved them with bold action. They're all partially right, but the deeper truth, that Marriner Eccles used one crisis to permanently centralize monetary control in Washington, that he built an architecture of power that would outlast every person in that room, that he executed a constitutional revolution without firing a shot or breaking a law, remains invisible. Years later, a historian will discover Eccles's private papers and write, "He was the most powerful banker in American history, and almost no one knew his name." Another will describe his achievement as the quiet consolidation of financial authority in a democratic state, a paradox that should trouble us more than it does. But these analyses will come decades later, when the system Eccles built has become so embedded in American governance that imagining an alternative seems impossible. On March 9th, 1933, at 11:47 p.m., none of that matters. What matters is that one banker, in 1 week, during one crisis, seized control of the financial architecture of the United States and walked away before anyone realized what he'd done.